Hey, welcome back to another OSRS item review slash buyer's guide where we talk about just how good items are for their value, how where they fit into a player's progression, etc., etc. I just want to thank everyone for all like the views and likes and comments on like the videos so far. It's been like getting quite a bit of traction, which I think is really cool to see. I'm not gonna ask you to like and subscribe to the channel. I don't really care, honestly, because I'm not like hellbent on being a YouTuber, as you can probably tell by the production quality of my videos. The only thing I ask of you is that if there's an item that you're dying to hear like some input about, go ahead and leave it in the comments below, because I'm always interested in just what items people are curious about, obviously. So today we're going to be talking about an item that nobody has requested. There's a couple items in the backlog that people have requested, but I've actually put those off so that I can talk about an item that I want to talk about, which is the Noxious Halberd. The Noxious Halberd. Now, I say thank you for like the support and traction and everything, and I'm probably about to piss you all off because a lot of people have a Noxious Halberd. A lot of like early game players have a Noxious Halberd. A lot of early game players really like their Noxious Halberd and use it at a lot of places. I don't have very many good things to say about the Noxious Halberd. We're gonna go ahead and get that straight out of the way, straight out of the gate. Is that this is ultimately going to be an item review where at the end of it, we are gonna walk away with me saying to you that I do not recommend you get this item if you are building your bank up. I think the Noxious Halberd only fits in at the very, very end once you've acquired basically everything else and have virtually nothing else to spend your money on. The reason is because in this weapon, I'm not going to say in my opinion, I'm just going to say it, it's criminally overrated. This item, simply put, for 46 mil, is meant to be, in the eyes of many players, a budget upgrade that they get when they like can't afford like a Soul Reaper axe or like an Inquisitor's mace or like a Blade of Saildor or obviously a scythe. They get this as their upgrade instead. That's the way that they see this, and they see this 46 mil as an investment into this upgrade, quote unquote, of a weapon. And this weapon, unfortunately, is ultimately not an upgrade, and certainly not one that's worth 46 mil over other options that you have available. What the heck am I talking about? Because, I mean, it's the Noxious Halberd, right? This is something that everybody uses at tons of bosses. Well, let's go ahead and start to break down the use cases. Now, I want to break the Noxious Halberd's use cases into three different categories, and those are Mainhand DPS, where it's just like, supposed to be a really strong slash or stab weapon, regardless of it being 2 range. It's just supposed to have good DPS, and that's the argument for it being used at these places. And then 2 range DPS, this is where it's specifically being used as a DPS weapon because of the fact that it has 2 range, and that makes it usable. And then utility is where it's not being used as a DPS weapon, but being used for some other miscellaneous role. So the Noxious Halberd, in case you aren't aware, is ultimately a beat stick. Like, it's just meant to be a very strong main hand weapon. It's a 5-tick weapon that hits really hard. And the idea is that it's supposed to be an upgrade over, like, a Tentacle Whip, basically. Because a Tentacle Whip costs 2.5 mil. This costs 45 mil. So surely this is better, and if it's not better, then, why are people using it? Well, there is one location where the Noxious Halberd is a best-in-slot weapon, and that is the Corporeal Beast. When it is at 70 defense or lower, it is better than an Osmumten's Fang. If Corporeal Beast has 70 or higher defense, the Osmumten's Fang is better. But if you are reducing Corporeal Beast's defense down to 0 or just very, very low, the Noxious Halberd is the best in slot weapon on stab against the Corporeal Beast by about 10%. A pretty significant margin. But now, and I'm expecting to get a lot of pushback in the comments from people who are like just, really wanting to defend their Noxious Halberd. In anticipation of that, I have gone ahead and I've prepared several DPS calcs to show you how the Noxious Halberd compares to an Abyssal Tentacle. So, the Noxious Halberd does have more accuracy than an Abyssal Tentacle, and so the more tanky a boss is, the more it tends to push back against a Tentacle Whip. But a Tentacle Whip is actually got more raw DPS, assuming that it's going to hit all the time. So how does this ultimately play out against the monsters that we care about? Well, in case you don't know how to read this here, what I have on the left is an Abyssal Tentacle setup in what I think is like a fair budget representation. A Torture, Bandos, a Face Guard, Berserker Ring Eye, and then the exact same setup on the other side with a Noxious Halberd. Now, we have various bosses that we're going to look at. The main numbers that you need to look at over here is the time to kill and the DPS number up at the top. That's going to tell you which setup is better. I mean, ultimately, you can just look at which one's green, and then this percent difference is going to tell you which one's better by how much. So we're looking at the boss we're looking at here is Verzik Vitur Phase 2. So P2 Verzik. The Noxious Halberd is 1.5% better than an Abyssal Tentacle in these setups. Okay, so that is an improvement. But now let's look at Pestilent Bloat. Well, the Noxious Halberd is actually 0.78% worse than an Abyssal Tentacle. Interesting. Now let's look at the Javelin Colossus, a Colosseum monster that you're going to be killing a lot if you're doing Colosseum runs. They're basically equivalent, but the Abyssal Tentacle is just very, very slightly better. Interesting. And then, it was like I said, the more tanky a boss gets, the more it does help the Halberd out. And the most extreme example of this that we have in the game is Vardorvis. He is the tankiest / weak monster that exists in the game. And he has a 2.1% advantage to the Noxious Halberd over an Abyssal Tentacle. That's not nothing, but just to give you an idea, I mentioned that time to kill, this TTK number that you should look at as well. That gives you a good idea of just how big of a difference this item is making for you. And for each of your Vardorvis kills, it's making about 0.8 seconds of a difference for 48 mil. And against various other bosses, it's actually doing worse for you than an Abyssal Tentacle. So this is why I say the Noxious Halberd is criminally overrated as a main-hand DPS weapon. Everyone seems to just be certain that this is an upgrade and a stepping stone weapon past an Abyssal Tentacle. It's not. This is a 2-range utility DPS weapon. Yes, it has 2-range utility, and that makes it very unique, but it's ultimately, in terms of DPS, putting about the same as an Abyssal Tentacle everywhere you can compare them. So moving on to the 2-range DPS use cases. So in these locations, the Noxious Halberd has the unique advantage of being 2-range and thus making it possible to melee these 2 bosses that normally cannot be meleeed. So what's it really worth at these 2 bosses where it opens up melee? Well, at Zulrah, it does okay. Minus 20% versus max isn't that bad. That's like roughly, that's a little bit worse than how a Sanguinesti staff fares versus max, for example, and it's less switches than like a full max T-bow and Shadow setup. It is minus 20% damage, so that's, you know, quite a bit less kills per hour. I will say, of the use cases that the Noxious Halberd has, I feel that Zulrah is one of the more valid ones, because it does actually accomplish what it's allegedly supposed to do there, which is minimize your switches and get you kills at a decent clip, although not an amazing one. Would I ever use it myself? Not really at Zulrah, but I could definitely see like a preference for it, and a very valid one at that. Now at Kriara, I really can't say the same thing, because at Kriara, if you want to know how a Noxious Halberd fares at Kriara, you have about 25% accuracy on the boss, and it's about the same DPS as a Dragon Crossbow in Black D'hide. That's not very good. Obviously, a Dragon Crossbow in Black D'hide is a lot less expensive than a Noxious Halberd, and I guess you're more tanky in melee gear, but if you compare it to anything that people normally use at Kree, like a Shadow or a Twisted Bow, it just gets completely destroyed. Minus 60% versus Shadow, it's something like minus 40% versus T-bow. It's really, really not great at Kree. Like, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should, you know? And Kree's kind of one of those situations, I feel, where, yeah, I mean, just because you can doesn't really make it a good option. Those kills are going to take a long time, and as tanky as you are in your melee armor, you're going to be taking a lot, you're going to be, like, fighting the boss a long time, and so you're probably going to take quite a bit more hits just for how long the boss is up. So yeah, I just don't recommend it at Kree. And then utility, it is a viable weapon to kill the mirror back Araxite with at Araxor. This is not the most straightforward thing to do, and most people that I've talked to prefer using a heavy ballista, including myself. I personally also prefer using a heavy ballista, because if you run in with it from the wrong distance away, then you end up next to the mirror back, and you end up taking the hit when you kill it, which kind of defeats the purpose of it. So yeah, it's ultimately got a utility role at Araxor, but it's one that requires you to understand how to use it. So I should have added on here on utility that there are a few CAs where the Noxious Halberd is very useful. One of those is a melee only Inferno. The Noxious Halberd is like almost essential for that CA, assuming you don't want to make it like way harder on yourself than you have to be. But that's just because it's really, useful to be able to attack those Inferno mobs from 2 tiles away when you're locked to melee. As a matter of fact, the 2-tile range, in most situations that I've heard people talk about, like who use a Noxious Halberd, they say at like Coliseum and at Taub that it's more of a pain in the ass than it actually is a benefit. And they use it in spite of the fact that it has that drawback, that it's like unwieldy to use because of the 2 range. Well, I always tell them, and I feel like they never believe me, but they don't need to do that. They don't need to subject themselves to that, because ultimately, again, like they could just be running a setup that, like at Coliseum, you could just run a Tentacle Whip and it's better. And then at Taub, depending on the room, you could just run a Tentacle Whip and it's better. And then ultimately, like across the raid, it's going to come out to pretty much like equivalent. I do want to mention real quick before we walk away from talking about the Noxious Halberd's use cases is that this is a very strong weapon in PvP. Its ability to inflict venom is very useful in PvP, unlike in PvM where pretty much everything's immune to it. And it also hits very, very hard, and the 2 range is useful in PvP fighting. So it's a really good PvP weapon. I'm not bashing on it as a PvP weapon at all. I'm bashing on it as a PvM weapon. My opinion falls right here. Unless you are doing specifically combat achievements, killing Zulrah in like an AFK fashion, or I don't know, basically using this weapon for its 2 range, I don't think that this has a place in your bank. And I think that if you're like, somebody whose melee gear is like at the point where they've got Bandos and maybe are like looking at getting their Avernic like pretty early on in their melee progression, a lot of those people tend to get a Noxious Halberd, and I would recommend to all of them to sell it. Because it's ultimately not benefiting you, especially not for the 45 mil that you're spending on it. Like I said, I expect a ton of pushback from the comments from people who like feel like they need to defend their Noxious Halberd. I'm sorry, but the weapon's not ultimately doing you any good.